The recent Treasury draft is telling you that exchange control is ending. It is also telling you that crypto is finally free. It is telling you that this is financial liberation. But I honestly believe that the system is shifting from control to surveillance, right? And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I believe there's a lot missing in that draft. I believe it is also hiding things from you, right? Because they are not removing control, they are just upgrading control. And we get to see this that because on the 17th of April, right, 2026, the National Treasury published the draft Capital Flow Management Regulations of 2026, a document that, if gazetted, it will repeal the exchange control regulations of 1961. Regulations that have been alive for about 65 years. Regulations that were first tightened after the Sharpeville. Regulations used through apartheid to lock capital inside this country's borders. And for the first time in 6 decades, crypto assets are being formally pulled inside South Africa's capital control perimeter. But I want you guys to note this, that this video is not about the headline, but it's all about what the headline is hiding from you as a regular South African. So please do stay with me. Because most people, after reading the draft and heard the news, they thought that this is great because it would lead to less bureaucracy. They thought that the gates are finally opening. But what they actually missed is that the gates are not opening. It's just that the gates are being replaced with a camera. And I wish you guys can understand how the old system worked, right? So if ever you wanted to move your money outside South Africa above your allowance, you had to go to your bank. And then your bank would go to an authorized dealer. The authorized dealer would apply to the South African Reserve Bank. Then the SARB would approve or deny. So the system was permission-based. Everything was prohibited unless it was explicitly allowed. And the system they're proposing now, it is where you can move your money, but every transaction is logged. Every large or high-risk transfer is reported, flagged, and potentially reversed after the fact. So Treasury's own language is that fewer pre-approvals, a focus on reporting, and the surveillance of high-impact and high-risk cross-border transactions, right? Surveillance, that word highlights itself. That word is in the official government's document. I promise you it's there. This is not the removal of control. This is control evolving from restriction to visibility. And right now, crypto is being captured, right? Because in May 2025, the Gauteng High Court held down a landmark judgment in the Standard Bank of South Africa versus the South African Reserve Bank. The case centered on a wholesale trading company called Leo Cash and Carry, which transferred over 4,400 Bitcoin valued at approximately around about, I think, 556 million rand to a crypto exchange in Seychelles. The South African Reserve Bank said that exchange control violation. The High Court responded and said Bitcoin is not a currency nor capital under the 1961 definition. So Bitcoin falls outside that framework. So the Reserve Bank could not touch it, and it was a temporal breathing room for the crypto industry, right? And a bombshell for the South African Reserve Bank. But the Reserve Bank immediately appealed, and Treasury did what governments always do when courts would not cooperate. They changed laws. So the draft Capital Flow Management Regulations of 2026 now explicitly define crypto assets as capital. And that single definition move resolves the court's battle through legislation. The loophole that the court defined is finally closed. And the question is, what does this mean practically for us? And I think this means cross-border crypto transactions above the threshold now will go through a licensed Treasury approved or authorized crypto asset service provider, because now we can no longer do it ourselves, right? So there are no longer quiet transfers to a foreign exchange. the licensed intermediary must be in the middle of everything, and crypto holders must now file land or written declarations within 3 days of their holdings. For future scenarios, they are compelled to hand over the private keys so that the state can seize their assets. And the penalties for non-compliance are up to 1 million rand in fines and about 5 years imprisonment. So as the CEO of the South African crypto exchange, Afridex, put it, that the response across the industry has been one of the widespread concern, and when we look into it, we can get to see the shift from what the system was to what it will be. It is much dangerous than it will do good. Yes, there will be benefits around it, but yeah, the system is going to be much more vulnerable now. But I want to step away from regulations for a moment, because what is happening right now, this transition from permission-based restriction to surveillance-based monitoring, I wrote actually about this framework, not as a prediction, right, about South Africa specifically, but as a structural analysis of what the digital finance does to power. And in my book, The Silent Ledger, which is subtitled The Human Cost of Economic Decisions, under chapter 41, which is one of my favorite chapters, where I talk about the true cost of convenience, where I look into digital finance and surveillance, I wrote this specifically. I said that every digital transaction can be tracked, traced, and analyzed, turning consumers into transparent entities whose financial activities are constantly under scrutiny. Right, and I want you to mark a keyword there: transparent entities. This does not protect citizens, right? It protects transparent entities, and that is exactly the architecture being built right now in South Africa. Your crypto wallet, your cross-border transfers, your digital holdings, all of it visible, traceable, and also analyzable, right? Chapter 41 also makes this observation, which I want you guys to think about, right, in context of the state, not the corporation, but the state holding this data. Because I believe financial data is particularly valuable because it offers a direct window into people's lives, their habits, their preferences, their vulnerabilities, right? And the key thing I want you guys to hold there is vulnerabilities themselves. And now, moving to chapter 30, which is also one of my favorite chapters also, where I talk about surveillance economics, where I look into data as the new currency. I argue that data becomes capital, and the more data they gather, the richer their control becomes. And when I wrote that, I was describing corporations, right, like Google Meta in this case. The surveillance capitalism model, like Shoshana Zuboff met, but you see, the capital flow management regulations are built, or are building something different, right? Yeah, they're building something different. This is state surveillance economics. The government is the database owner. The government is running the monitoring system. And the government gains access to financial profile of every South African with meaningful crypto exposure. And I believe that is a fundamental different power dynamic than being tracked by an algorithm that wants to sell your sneakers. Now I want to go somewhere most commentators will never go, because calling this surveillance is easy, right? But identifying specifically how it will fail and who will pay the price, I think that's the harder work to do, because South Africa does not really have the infrastructure yet to implement what these regulations are promising. Honestly speaking, real-time monitoring across licensed crypto assets as providers requires cross-platform data integration and analytical capacity that does not fully exist yet. And as of December 2024, I think the FSCA had processed about 420 crypto assets service provider applications. About 248 were approved, 106 were voluntarily withdrawn because of compliance costs that were too high, and about 77, if I'm not wrong, are still under review. And you get to see that when regulation outpaces institutional capacity, enforcement becomes uneven to the point where large, well-resourced players will be able to comply, but the small operators will navigate uncertainly. Ordinary crypto holders without compliance teams are often left guessing, And in a country like South Africa, where inequality is structurally embedded, it will not be a technical glitch, right? It can never be a technical glitch. So it will be a structural advantage for those with resources, and it will be a vulnerability for those without resources, So the new framework generates enormous reporting volumes. I can agree. Like every transaction report or every travel route data packet, which has been mandatory for crypto transfers since I think April 30, 2025. We're talking about your every flagged account here. But I think the question now starts to be, what happens when your volume exceeds capacity to process intelligently? Because I believe the outcome of that will be false positives, where ordinary citizens are flagged as suspicious, accounts will be blocked, your funds will be frozen. And if you have observed how South African regulatory bodies manage backlogs, it's a horror story. Because you will know that resolution can take months, sometimes years, and during which your money will be sitting in controlled accounts and your business will not be able to operate for quite some time, And thinking deeper about it, when we look into administrative errors in a surveillance-heavy system, it does not really require malicious intent, because it only requires an overwhelmed institution, right, and an asymmetric burden of proof. So regulations will create a centralized registry of crypto holdings. That means every South African with meaningful crypto exposure, your name, your ID number, your wallet address, your holdings amounts, they will be aggregated into one database accessible by the Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank, right? And I'm not against this, but my core argument lies on, I want you to consider this context, that South Africa has been ranked amongst the top 3 African countries for fraud growth in 2024, where we're about, I think, 310% compared to 2023, according to the SARB's Identity Fraud Report. And if that centralized crypto registry would be breached in an environment where we have that 310% fraud growth, the question is not really whether the breach can be attempted, but the question is that can the defenses be able to hold? And if ever they would fail to hold, then the consequences will be catastrophic, So this means full financial profiles, your wallet addresses, your holdings, all these will be exposed to whoever goes in or gets in that registry. So centralization means one successful attack defeats all protection simultaneously, And this means it's just one node. You just need to hit one node. A single point of failure. There's a single point of failure here. So, you see, the new system is... It's not what I thought. I don't really think we're ready for it, because I'm not really arguing that South Africa should not regulate crypto, because I think that would be intellectually dishonest. But I think regulation is necessary. Mirror Trading International, one of the, I think, largest crypto frauds in African history, right here in South Africa. It shows us that the absence of it will cost ordinary people, illicit capital flight will genuinely damage a developing economy. Regulation has legitimate purpose. That's what I believe. But like I said, in chapter 41 of my book, and looking into what the capital flow management regulations confirm, I think expansion of the financial surveillance comes with a trade-off to the landlord to us that is almost never disclosed into any press release. And that trade-off is that this convenience in exchange for visibility It means that fewer forms to fill in exchange for full transparency of your financial life to the state. And South Africa with a 310% fraud growth rate, an institutional implementation gap, and no robust data protection framework tied specifically to financial surveillance data. That trade-off it is not balanced. I think I don't really believe it is balanced. So I feel like there's a lot to lose as of yet than for us to win. And we get to see that in the old world, the strategy was to stay hidden, move money out of sight. But in the new world, the strategy is to stay structured, to understand the system deeply enough to move within it on your own terms. Because, you see, in this new system, in this new architecture, invisibility is not protection, right? Invisibility is risk. So you must try and find ways to be visible, right? And that is what the system thinking looks like when the system changes, But I think it is important for every South African to ensure they position themselves